Hello, this is Steve Crom with OXYGY Management Consulting. We help clients rethink, innovate, and change the way work gets done. Sustainability today is an opportunity to innovate. It's an opportunity to engage employees. It's an opportunity to strengthen the purpose and reputation of enterprises, which today is more important than ever. This is a two-part series with Andrew Hobday, who was the global head of sustainability for Mars. The first in this series touches on sustainability, engagement, and innovation. I'm delighted to have Andrew with me. Please introduce yourself, Andrew.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute. So, I'm Andrew Hobday. I was Chief Sustainability at Mars for 6 years as part of a 25-year career with the company. Mars, as many people know, is best known for its snack, chocolate and confectionery products like M&M's, Mars and Snickers, and for its pet food products, Pedigree, Whiskers, Sheba and Caesar, for example. So in that sense, we're a company that was very much part of the food industry. I'm a scientist by background, so I've always had an interest in the planet and its inhabitants and its ecology. And although most of my career has been spent in manufacturing and R&D, I've actually worked also in many different business units and so have a relatively broad business background. And I think that was important as a context, if you like, in why I ended up being offered this role.
So by the time, Andrew, you started this role as the head of sustainability, you were well established in the company, had a good network, and I'm sure that was a huge asset. So say more about when things started and why the focus it's on sustainability at Mars when it did take off.
Okay, so Mars is a private multinational business, and although it had always had an interest in sustainability through its operations, driven not least by an enthusiasm of the family owners, and it had also taken an interest in the practices used in its supply chain and the initiatives of those different players in the supply chain. These various programs were not well coordinated and the impacts of them were not fully calculated. So that was one component. The second component, it was becoming increasingly clear that our various stakeholders, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, didn't just want to hear about our brands and our products, but they also wanted to hear a little bit about the company behind those brands and products. And at the time I became the Chief Sustainability Officer, which was just after the financial crisis in 2008, that context became even more important because the transparency of businesses and how they conducted themselves became a much more a broader topic that was of interest to society at large.
Interesting. So that means that the sustainability topic then was linked to reputation.
Yes,
to a degree.
Exactly. And we are a private company. We were a private company, and so that reputational issue was a difficult one because you're trying to trade off the risk of talking almost too much and sharing too many inside components of a business that's owned privately, but at the same time needing to do something that was a bit more transparent and help our various stakeholders understand a little bit more about who Mars is as opposed to what our products and our brands are.
So 2008 is an interesting time to really start a sustainability focus, because I would imagine, Andrew, that some people would say, well, we'll do it when we can afford to, or right. But it's an interesting time that, in the middle of a global crisis.
I think that was more of a catalyst, Steve, than the reason behind it. I think the pressure had been building inside the business for a while. And, not least of which from the owners themselves, because they were getting increasingly frustrated that what they saw as their good work and history in this area wasn't being properly represented as part of a coherent business message. So that helped them to overcome this reluctance, if you like, to be a little bit more open to the outside world.
Was there any connection at the time to resilience and for the business?
Oh, yes. I think being in the food business, most of our raw materials are in the agricultural sector. And so clearly by the mid-2000s, 2005, 6, it was becoming even more clear that the issue of climate change and environmental impacts was becoming more significant. And it was going to, if we didn't address it ourselves directly, along with other industry players, it could potentially derail our whole business thinking and strategy, and not least of which, stop the world as a whole. But the bit we were directly interested in, yes, it was a business risk to us.
So if we go back in time, Andrew, tell me a little bit more about where you started in the business and how it evolved.
My brief was to develop a more coherent strategy towards sustainability, and we'll talk about that in a sec, and to initiate the various programs and activities which would support that strategy. And as I said, it was really in part to help the family, if you like, from their point of view, do justice to what they've been enthusiastic about for many years. So I think if I talk about the overall approach, the best way of summarizing it in 2 words was an evolution from internal to external. So what do I mean by that? I mean, moving from focusing on things which were within your direct control to things which impacted the whole supply chain. From things where you needed to get your own basic house in order to areas where you could talk about it more broadly in public. In other words, don't talk about anything until you've sorted out your big problems and worked out how you're going to address them. It meant educating people inside the business first about what it was we were trying to do, why we were trying to do it. And of course, in the area of sustainability, because it's such an interesting topic and most people are impacting it and impacted by it in their daily lives, then inside Mars, it wasn't really a difficult topic to get traction with because people were already interested in it. But again, we had to start internally before we moved to start talking about what it was we were going to do. So when I started the role, we didn't really talk about anything externally to start with. It was more about who are we, what are we trying to do, what are we trying to measure, and I'll come back to that again later, but figuring out the impacts that you have and the way in which you want to address those impacts is one of the key parts of the strategy. Again, there's no point talking about great things you're going to achieve, wonderful ambitions, unless you've got a solid foundation. How do you measure the CO2 impact? How do you measure the life cycle of your products? And are those measurements capable of being audited externally? By that, I mean the various people and NGOs and organizations that are going to watch Mars and look at how we operate will also question the numbers we produce. And so anything you do start talking about, you need to make pretty sure is robust and open to scrutiny as well. So yes, I think it evolved then, and once very much, and that's a process that took several years rather than weeks or months, Steve.
And when you say the internal, and I like very much the idea that be sure that our own house is in order and let's demonstrate that we're having an impact. That sounds to me like I would look at factories, our supply chain, our procurement.
Yes, so in energy terms, for example, if you take one of the components of a strategy, which would be how do you reduce your CO2 impacts, and most of the CO2 impacts come from energy use, you'd start with your factories. How much energy do we use? Where are we using most energy? And how do we choose a strategy to reduce the energy, point one, and two, change the energy source and move away from fossil fuels to renewables. And you do that before you start trying to have detailed conversations with your suppliers and customers about how they might reduce energy, for example. And in many cases, in absolute numbers, the impacts across the supply chain outside your direct operations are bigger, more substantial than those inside. But that's not the point. The point is to demonstrate that you've got your own house sorted out, you've got a program, and also you know what you're doing, you know what you're measuring, and then it gives you a bit more credibility to go out into the outside world and start engaging and enthusiastically, if you like, motivating the people up and down the supply chain.
Makes perfect sense. So you're really doing several things simultaneously. You're learning and developing momentum on things that are more within your control. You're developing credibility. You know better your own system, so what you should expect and require, right, from suppliers and others up and down.
Yeah, and you need to. You can't measure everything. You can't work on everything. But in most businesses, in my experience, Steve, there are a handful of key impacts, things that are a result of your company being in existence in the world, and things, therefore, that as a result of that you'd like to improve and either make go away, or how can we reduce or eliminate waste totally from our factories, for example. We've already talked about energy. How do you make a significant impact and move to zero CO2 emissions by 2030, which was one of our key objectives at the time. But it's a matter of choosing those, and then you can go to your various customers, stakeholders, and other key people in the supply chain and say, hey, look, this is what making Snickers involves, and how about we do this, this, and this to try and reduce our overall impacts in these areas. The other thing I'd say as well is that if you're part of a multinational corporation, the impacts might be quite different in different parts of the world geographically. So, for example, if you're choosing renewable energy sources, there are probably 5 or 6 key different technologies that you can employ to substitute for fossil fuels. Any one of those may be much more effective in one part of the world as compared to another. So, for example, solar power, okay, self-evidently, it's much more efficient and much more cost-effective where you've got a lot more sun.
Another thing I'm interested, Andrew, when you started this, you said you had a relatively positive reception from your colleagues in Mars. One of our hypotheses, but tell us what you think, is that it makes good business sense, right? That if you do this, it's going to have a payback. But beyond that, it's a chance to engage employees and to really create a sense of stronger purpose. Do you agree, disagree?
Yes, absolutely. So when I was talking about the education program, it was really about getting to all the employees in Mars, not just the senior people. Obviously, the message to them is slightly different, which is about how do we put together a strategy here that actually can be incorporated into our overall strategy that you can buy into as leaders of your business units. Whereas the engagement of the broader group of employees in the business is more about saying, hey, this is who we are in Mars, this is what we're trying to do. We can all play a part in this, and everybody should play a part of it. How can you do that? How can we all help each other make this place a more successful organization?
And do you think that helped make Mars more attractive as an employer?
Oh, I was going to mention that. I mean, not least of which, in the end, we're in a competitive game of trying to recruit good people who can help us and help the business be successful. And these days, young people just don't want to work for a company that doesn't kind of, in a way, wear its heart on its sleeve and say, this is what we're trying to do, this is how we operate, this is what we stand for, here are some of our principles, and how does sustainability fit with that? So I was going to mention it later, but let me cover it now. I think if you're talking to companies about how do you develop and how do you think about a sustainability program, one of the first places you should start is what are our existing values? What do we stand for as a business? Aside from sustainability, what are we trying to do? Because unless you then develop a program for sustainability, which is totally integrated with that and totally consistent with that, it just becomes window dressing. And people will see through that very quickly. And they'll spot the fact that you're doing something as a token gesture rather than something that is actually true to your business.
What was it about the Mars vision and values that you were able to kind of reinforce with sustainability?
Well, Mars has something that very dear at its heart, which we call the 5 principles. And as part of those 5 principles, there were one of them, for example, is efficiency. Another one is freedom. And what they would mean to people inside and outside the business are how can we operate sustainably in a way which is consistent with those 5 principles. So, for example, then energy reduction became very obviously something that was entirely consistent with our business philosophy. We've driven cost reductions and energy reductions for many years in the corporation. What we hadn't done is do it from a more sustainable lens, if you like. So when we came to develop and implement the program, it was entirely consistent that we just fine-tuned, if you like, the words and the way in which we were going to do it, which made it entirely consistent with the history of Mars. And as I said, the family in particular had been extremely positive and enthusiastic about environmental projects, using wastewater recycling in many parts of the world, for example. But what we hadn't done at the time was pull it together into an overall program that could be properly measured and tracked and talked about.
So you're a scientist by training, Andrew. Do you think that sustainability could be a source for innovation and for looking at things differently and for...
Sure. Absolutely. I think that one of the messages I've been trying to give as I'm talking to you, Steve, is to not think about sustainability as a reactive thing, to think about it as a proactive thing. How can you make the business more successful financially? How can you make it more resilient in its marketplace? How can you make it a better recruiter and a more attractive place to work? All those things, if you like, require innovation. Obviously, the products themselves, which are at the heart of the business, are if you like, the real core of that innovative process. You know, how do we develop new materials which don't consume as much of the Earth's resources that can go into our product? How can we develop lower sugar, lower salt products which are healthier but still have a great taste? That requires innovation. Now, all those things, if you like, have innovation at their heart, because without wanting to do things differently, you're not going to be successful. And as you rightly alluded to, and I make no apologies for that, a lot of them have got science at their heart as well.
Thank you, Andrew, for a stimulating session. Thanks to all of you for listening to this podcast in our series on sustainability. Please join the dialogue via OXYGY's LinkedIn page and or our website. We look forward to hearing from you.